right. So in that previous video, you mentioned all of the Notes.ini settings that we would come to know and love to be able to manage all of this stuff. So I see a very long list here. Go ahead and take it away.
So, ironically, this list doesn't actually contain the configuration notes.inis. Those are all in the documentation, which is the first link here, that walks you through what INIs to set to configure what things. Um, However, these are all debug settings, as you can see by the debug starting off on here. And so if you're having problems getting your environment working, there are a couple of, common mistakes that we've seen that people make while doing the configuration. So a couple of the key ones are that, OIDC must be used over TLS. It is a hard requirement in the spec. So if you do not have TLS properly configured on your Domino server, you won't be able to use OIDC or HTTP bearer authentication. Both are only supported over TLS. And so this means if you have a network terminator that is terminating TLS in front of your Domino server, these flows won't work. You'll need to tell your terminator to negotiate TLS against your Domino server as well. And we've had number of discussions and postings and helpful tips and tricks in different places on easy ways to generate that sort of a lightweight private certificate between your web proxy and the Domino server. So you cannot configure an OIDC provider for your default internet site because it doesn't have a DNS host name. And the DNS host name is used as the key to index that OIDC provider. So for the love of all that is sacred, don't randomly guess at a trusted root in your IDP cat. When you're building that OIDC provider document, please do not say, oh, I think this might be the right route and cut and paste something in, because tragedy will likely ensue.
And is
Uh,
that
I've
properly laid out in the documentation, that first link that you had at the top there?
yes,
Like, is it?
the how to configure that is laid out in the documentation, and I believe I've seen other presentations through OpenNTF where Daniel Nash has described
Yep.
how to acquire and configure these trusted routes. So I would actually, recommend taking a look at some of those presentations, as he has some server console commands you can use to fetch the trusted route from a URL and drop it directly into the cert store, where
Yeah.
you can then link to it from your IDP cat. And if you've configured a trusted route and everything stopped working, try the debug OIDC curl APIs Notes.ini, and that will tell you what's going wrong with all those trust failures. And the other common error that we see is when the configuration endpoint hasn't been configured correctly. So there is only one URL to configure, but that URL needs to be correct. So, if it doesn't start with HTTPS://, it's not going to work. If you leave off the path, if your provider has it's actually on /OAuth2/v2/ whatever, you need to include all of that pattern. In fact, some of the in the early access drops that we had for 12.02, we had issues where people were configuring the full well-known endpoint, the full dot well-known / OpenID configuration URL in their base URL, and we were rejecting it because we were appending that well-known URL on the end again. So we've fixed that in 12.02 Gold. So although we recommend using the base URL, if you find the provider's well-known endpoint and paste that full URL into the base URL, that will work. But if you see, either of these complaints that the configuration endpoint doesn't contain all of the right information, you probably have the wrong endpoint, or else you're pointing it to someone who doesn't actually support OIDC. So there are a handful of providers out there, I won't name names, but they expose a well-known endpoint, but they, don't expose a token endpoint, or they don't support, some of the basic. They don't have they don't expose a JWKS URI endpoint. They're missing something fundamental. So it's like someone tried to tick a box in the yes, we support OIDC, but no, they don't follow the standard. So by all means, if you are testing with providers that we haven't mentioned that aren't listed in the doc or in a tech note, and you're running into problems, please let us know through one channel or another, and we can, take a look at it ourselves and tell you either, nope, Twitter does not support OIDC, or we can say, well, they claim to support OIDC, but there's a claim that's missing, and maybe we can figure out a workaround in a future release to make that provider work with Domino.
So back to these Notes.ini settings, from a troubleshooting standpoint, are these documented, or presumably the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 goes from no logging to verbose logging?
Yes, the innies themselves are in the documentation. The pattern that I try to use in all of my debug INIs is that 0 is disabled. I tend to set them to 0 rather than deleting it entirely, just so I can find the INI, so I don't need to, search the source code or the documentation to remember what the name was. 1 is log errors only. So 1 should be silent in the 99% case, unless you're running against, say, a slightly non-standard provider that is doing something that we don't like but can tolerate. You could be seeing logs at the =1 level in some cases here. And as you crank up the logging, it gets more and more and more verbose.
More verbose, yeah.
The top settings on each of these will utterly melt your server console. So I recommend against turning them on unless you really need to deep dive on a problem or support asked you to turn it on. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
So this is a very sad slide. It's an admission of guilt on my part. It's we could not, achieve world peace in 1202 GA. There are limitations in our functionality. So all of what we've talked about here is only supported on Windows and Linux.
Can I ask
it's all...
if this is their plan for IBMI? Or would you put up a different Domino server?
I would recommend putting up a different Domino server.
Okay.
I wouldn't hold your breath waiting for OS 400.
Okay.
So one thing that SAML can do is that OIDC cannot, is you can use SAML to acquire ID files from the vault. So with, encrypted mail operations with Verse or Traveler, and for Notes federated login with the Notes client. And you can use SAML with Nomad as well for that initial setup. You can't do that with OIDC yet. With OIDC, you can only log into the HTTP server. You cannot also log into the ID vault. That's something that we're, looking into the best way to accomplish, but we didn't get there in 1202. So because this functionality for OIDC login was added after template freeze, we weren't able to place some GUI configuration. So we have Notes.inis for configuring the client ID and client secret. Those client ID and client secrets being innies means you can only have one per Domino server, which means you can only have one partnership configured for OIDC login at a time. So you can have OIDC login and HTTP bearer authentication configured on the same Domino server, and you could have, 6 different providers configured for HTTP bearer authentication, but only one of those would be usable for OIDC login because we can only configure one client ID and one client secret at a time. And yeah, some of these other limitations are fairly nitpicky. So, I mean, you're not going to run into many problems because we only support client secret basic authentication because that's what practically everyone uses by default, and most people don't support anything else. But one more thing that I would like to note here is that bearer authentication doesn't support limited access scopes in 1202. So those of you who have been using the AppDev pack in order to use HTTP bearer authentication against your Domino server are used to being able to configure all sorts of custom, scopes and restrictions in a special database. And Gordon can tell you about that in far more detail than I could. But the only scope that is supported in 1202 in an access token is domino.user.all. And when you set that scope, that token has the end user's full access to that Domino server. It doesn't restrict, read versus write, or mail files versus something else, or this database versus that database. So making that functionality really more suitable for first-party applications where you have the user sitting in front of a single-page application or a mobile app or a native app, and it's the user on the client accessing their data on their Domino server, as opposed to a third-party application where a user with a web browser is contacting a third-party web server, which is then using the access token on their behalf to contact Domino. Because, the user having access to all of their data is one thing. A third-party web server having access to all of the user's data is another. And so we placed that scope, and it is a mandatory scope, simply to ensure that any administrators who are configuring that functionality are fully aware of exactly what they are doing, that they are making this token valid for all of this user's access to this Domino server. I've been babbling for a while. Are there any questions on this slide? Any points that,
I don't think so. For me, this is actually an excellent slide because it illustrates that you guys have more work to do, and you said that up front. But it's clearly an opportunity for people who are ready to use this kind of authentication to be able to start to build their solutions and test their solutions with the expectation that a near future release, shall we say, is going to provide more flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely. We are actively working on enhancing this functionality in our, current development code streams. And I'm available through a number of different forums and mediums. So, please, if there is functionality you want in this space that you're not seeing in 1202, if you want, support for more providers or, certain, not necessarily custom changes, but things that would be broadly applicable to, many applications, not just your one custom application off on the side, please let us know, and I'll see what we can do to get that out to you.
And
Yeah,
is using
go ahead, Michelle.
Is using an AHA a good method of getting that to you to provide, so people can provide their feedback and vote on those changes?
Yeah, AHA is an excellent forum because, that will help us determine that something isn't a request for one application, but a request that is broadly applicable for a large number of people.
Okay, thanks.
And of course, the one-off questions, you're active on the Discord server, OpenNTF Discord server, so people can find you there too.
Right.
Wonderful. All right. I think we should wrap it up here. That was excellent, very informative. I know I learned some stuff. So very much appreciate your time. Thanks for this whole series.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.